Hello, and welcome to this webinar for the JCT Young Professionals Group, hosted by Osborne Clarke today, with speakers myself, Rob Horne, partner in the Construction and Engineering Disputes and Risk team, and Tom Andrews, a senior associate in the same team. We've set ourselves the perhaps rather ambitious target of talking about the future of construction today, and we'll try and break that down into some manageable pieces as we go. I'll start off by talking a little about the current landscape, where we are at the moment. What does it look like? How does it feel, at least from my perspective, and how I see the industry from the conversations that I'm having. I'll pass on to Tom to talk a little bit more about what we've labelled here, the immediate challenges. What's happening and likely to happen in the relatively foreseeable future that everyone should be aware of and everyone should be thinking about, perhaps preparing for and dealing with. And then we'll spend a little bit of time looking at the longer term opportunities. What's the general direction of the industry as a whole? Where's it going? What sorts of things, with that sort of horizon scanning eye, should we be thinking about looking at? What's interesting that's out there? What are the new developments that everyone should be, I suppose, looking at as career-long aspirations? Just one word of housekeeping right at the outset. There is a Q&A function on this platform. If you have any questions during any of the presentations, please do use that Q&A function. We have time anticipated at the end for dealing with any questions that have come through, and we'd very much like to deal with any questions that you've got, rather than it just being just about our personal experiences. So please do use that Q&A function. So moving on, looking at the current landscape, Tom and I did this presentation about 9 months ago, so right in the middle of lockdown, right in the middle of the COVID pandemic, where we'd finished one wave, we're just coming into another wave, lockdown had happened and was about to happen again, and everything was very difficult to predict. So the current landscape then was dramatically different, I would say, to where we are even today, with the latest announcements coming from government yesterday on further relaxations of the COVID rules. But even so, there are quite a lot of similarities. The landscape doesn't change that fast. So hopefully a lot of the points are still highly relevant to what we're looking at today. What I've done is just picked out a few key questions that we should all be asking ourselves and thinking about in terms of not only our business, but the business of those that we work for, whether you're a professional services provider, or you might be a contractor, or you might be a developer or an investor. It doesn't really matter. These questions are relevant to anyone who's involved with or engaged in the construction industry. So the first bullet point here, and this became very clear during the pandemic, that construction was labelled a key public service. Now, during the pandemic, that had a very particular meaning in focusing on ensuring that construction as a sector of the UK economy continued to build, continued to deliver projects all the way through lockdown with enhanced social distancing, etc. But that label hasn't gone away. And I think it's really important to understand exactly how important a role construction plays to our economy. And it's not just new build construction, which everyone focuses on very quickly and very easily. You know, the new motorway, the new bridge. Imagine a new railway running from London to Birmingham, new power stations. All very easy to look at those sorts of projects, but it's a key public service because it goes beyond that into regeneration of existing infrastructure, and not just regeneration, but operation and maintenance of that infrastructure. That's all bundled up within what we talk about as a construction industry. And that really is the point under this bullet of can you really put all of that into one place and say it's a single industry where the needs and the diversity of what people are trying to achieve is just so different across that range of different people, different project types. So can you really say construction's a key public service, or do you need to be a little bit more specific? And the reason for that question that we should be posing ourselves now is you can't start to look at the future unless you really understand what it is we're doing right now. So why are we a public service? Why is the construction industry a key public service? What does that mean when we talk about construction as an industry? And the next question here is looking at, well, taking that a step further in trying to identify why we're talking about a key public service. Office for National Statistics, the ONS, identifies that approximately 6% of gross domestic product of the UK is carried out within the general banner of the construction sector. And within that, 7% of all of the workforce in the UK is committed to construction operations. All of that is carried out on approximately a 1 to, let's say, 3% profit margin for contractors. And the question I pose is that sustainable? When you start looking at what are we trying to achieve as an industry, what does the future really look like? A lot of it is driven by the very baseline. How profitable is it? How do you create a sustainable industry that creates necessarily a lot of risk? But how do you share that in order to enable that industry to thrive? Remembering that that industry takes up 6% of gross domestic product, 7% of all the workforce. I think what we've seen is where we start to come out of the pandemic and everything starts to be released again, we'll see the devastating impact that that lockdown had on some sectors, not as much construction, funnily enough, but other sectors, whether it's entertainment, hospitality, retail, massively impacted. All smaller parts of the gross domestic product as a whole, all employing a smaller proportion of the total workforce of the UK. So what special protections, what should we be doing to ensure that construction carries on? When Tom and I did this talk during the pandemic, this was a real question, the adversarial versus collaborative culture and what achieves the best results. Now, we know that contracting forms have been getting closer and closer to collaboration and focusing more on parties working together. And I think during the pandemic, we saw a lot of that, a lot of problem solving, a lot of we're all in this together sort of attitude. As we've started to come out of the other side of the pandemic, the concern, the fear is we'll see a backtracking on that collaborative effort, and we'll see more adversarial discussions taking place, a much more adversarial industry, even than it was before the pandemic, just because cash has become king and people need to recover their cash. I think that's going to be a theme going forwards, generally across the industry over short, medium and long term, is exactly what sort of industry do we all want to work within, because the only people who can change it are us as the practitioners within that industry. Next bullet point here is the difference or the comparison between big businesses and self-employed individuals or small enterprises within the construction industry. Now, I've used self-employed in a fairly loose sense, but that's 13% of all businesses. And this is being reflected by those businesses that are registered for VAT purposes. Not all self-employed people carrying out construction work will be registered for VAT. So that number is probably at the lowest end. But looking at the comparison between, let's say, some of the giant contractors, whether that's a Balfour Beatty or a Laing O'Rourke or a Kier, at one end of the spectrum with hundreds of million a year in turnover, again on that 1% profit margin, all the way down to the one or two-person enterprises carrying out small works or bespoke or specific works, trying to identify a way of managing all of that is very difficult. And really what we've seen through the pandemic, and we're going to see coming out the other side of it, is who's fared best? Has it been big business with deeper pockets and more resilience, more strength in depth, more ability to have a long-term sustainable supply chain? Or is it the self-employed, the small businesses that can be more agile and find new ways of exploiting opportunities? I think probably as we've gone through the pandemic, the small enterprises have been disproportionately heavily hit because they've missed out on the key involvement in government and large framework contracts. The interesting part is as we come out to the other side of the pandemic and the private sector market really starts to open up, and we are seeing that, there's a lot of work being done out there, is that agility going to be a marked benefit, enabling those smaller businesses to increase their margin, partly through that agility and ability to deliver something different, but also because there just isn't much labour, materials, etc. in the market, so it's now becoming a premium product. Lots of difficult issues in there, which are linked very closely to that supply chain. And is that something that holds the industry back or something that really grounds it to reality? So if you look at a typical construction project, the supply chain might be 3, 4, 5, maybe dozens of steps long before you find the bottom rung in that ladder from main contractor all the way down to specialist supplier. It can be very useful. It spreads risk, enables people to focus on what they're really good at. But equally, if you break that chain, it develops all sorts of difficulties for the industry. And we're starting to see some echoes of that where we've had Brexit, which I know Tom will talk about in a little while, where we've had other issues around supply of materials, where the market gets very difficult. When we did this presentation 9 months ago, we talked a little bit about the industry being too tied to mistakes of the past. And when you look back, are we so focused on defending the problems that might have occurred 6, 12 years ago that we're stopping improving going forwards because we don't have the profit margin, we don't have that research and development ability to improve ourselves going forwards? Now, I think, interestingly, over the last few days, there's been a new emphasis placed on that with the talk around the new Housing Act and how that's going to increase the ability for homeowners to go back now up to possibly 15 years to recover damages for defective buildings. Now, if that gets passed into law, and it's only a draft at the moment, if that gets passed into law, there'll be an awful lot of companies looking back, not the 6 years they thought they had a liability for, but potentially over 15 years, which is very difficult as an industry to deal with. Now, the other thing that's very important about that draft act is it's intended to have retrospective effect. So there's nothing that anyone in the industry can do now to fix any of those mistakes that have occurred in the past, other than understand the risk, mitigate it, and try to deal with any of the issues that come out of it. I've already mentioned the skills shortage. But I think the key question on this bullet point is it really being addressed? Everyone talks about there being a skills shortage, and Mark Farmer did an excellent report maybe 4 or 5 years ago now called Modernise or Die, and really there were no punches pulled in that report about how important it was to develop as an industry, to modernise our practices, to use modern method of construction, whether that's off-site or modular buildings or more technology. All of that is really important. Having said all of that, how much have we moved along that timeline? Yes, a bit, but are we moving fast enough to deal with that skills shortage? And I suspect the answer to that is no, we're not moving fast enough. And I think what we're seeing in the market at the moment is there is a dramatic skills shortage across the industry. The last bullet point I wanted to pick up arises out of the Queen's speech from this government's latest term in Parliament. And the focus here was that the government has said it wants to see £600 billion of investment in infrastructure, and for the moment we'll equate infrastructure with construction. So £600 billion, which is an enormous sum of money. But that 600 billion isn't all coming from public funds. Half of that is anticipated to come from private investment. So the question that we're facing ourselves in the industry now is, well, where's that private investment coming from and where's it going to? What projects are being supported through private investment? Remembering that there is no private finance initiatives, no PFI in a formal sense anymore, as there has been in the past, maybe 15 years ago. So where is all of that private investment coming from and going to? really big and important question for the whole industry to start tackling. Trying to break that all down into some pieces, if you like, to make it a little bit more easy to get hold of and think about in a real sense. I've tried to break down these sort of the expectation into these three time periods, and we'll come back to those looking at sort of broader themes towards the end of this presentation. The first one is really this year, so effectively the next 6 months. What are we likely to see? I think we're going to see a lot of movement on whether we're going to continue with our view on collaboration. I think that's particularly the case where the restrictions on insolvency are due currently to be lifted in September. So by midway through the second half of the year, we're going to have a really clear idea as to whether people want to work together to solve problems, or they're going to choose or be forced to become insolvent and drop out of the industry entirely. We've seen last year a lot of without prejudice letters, short-term deals being done to enable projects to proceed. I think what we're likely to see in this next period up to December is some of those and an increasing number start to get unwound. So whilst there might have been a short-term deal, it was never the intention that it prejudices the overall approach to the project. So we'll see complicated, difficult final account negotiations. We'll see difficult and more adjudications because people now can see the ability to make more money. The industry's back and running, and actually services being provided at a premium. So it's appropriate to start spending some money to recover what was lost last year. Equally, there's low cash reserves amongst quite a number of contractor levels. And that is putting a lot of pressure on the bottom line. It will raise the rate of insolvency, but also means that people have to start looking at the recoverability of debt. How do I get money back into my long-term balance sheet and stop worrying about the month-to-month profit and loss account? That's going to be a really big challenge, I think, across the industry in this short-term next 6 months period. I identified the skill shortage, material availability. That has been hard all of this year, post-Brexit, with the pandemic and everything else running as well. That's going to continue undoubtedly through to the end of this year, and I think future. Moving on to that medium term, so what's going to happen next year? And again, we're starting to see shadows of this already. Lots of pressure on insurers, particularly around reduced supervision of projects. So I talked a little bit about construction as an industry carrying on quite well through the pandemic, but that's meant that there has been reduced ability to, reduced focus on supervision and quality of the work. So is there going to be more insurance claim? The insurance market's certainly tightening and it's becoming much harder to get insured at all or insured at anything like the premium that would have been paid in the last year or two. Linked to that, there's likely to be a rising defect identification, particularly where we're coming to completion on buildings that have been part completed under COVID-restricted social distancing measures and partly in a normal sphere, or how we would normally carry out building works. That distinction, I think, is going to start landing next year, but we'll see some of it towards the end of this year as well. And we'll see the flow-on effect from the release of insolvency and the continued recovery of debt through retrospective claims. So looking back over 18 months back from now, so back to March 20, and really looking at what's recoverable, how do we get profit back into our business? And then trying to look a little bit further forwards, what are the other problems, what are the other solutions, what else is looking interesting out there? Again, debt and borrowings focus, that focus on the longer term balance sheet rather than the short term profit and loss is going to become a really big issue. What companies are still viable? M&A activity, are we going to see a lot of consolidation of, particularly I think in the mid-sized contractors, but not just the contractors. I think you're going to see it with developers, potentially also with investors. Certainly we're seeing investors now on the private sector looking at asset classes they would never have looked at in the past, simply because there's an opportunity there to buy assets at a good rate and make a good return on them. the last point there, again, something we'll pick up in a lot more detail later on, is are we going to start seeing an escalation or a rapid escalation in technology being introduced to construction? I think we are still very much at the beginning of that. There's lots of tech out there. Is it making a mainstream significant impact? Possibly not at the moment, but definitely one to keep an eye on in that longer term January 23 onwards period. So lots of issues to think about there, and lots of things going on in the industry, even in that relatively short-term space. I'm going to hand over to Tom now to talk a little bit more about the immediate challenges facing the industry. Tom.
Thanks very much, Rob. So in this section, we'll have a look at some of the immediate threats facing the industry, as Rob says, and touch on some of the options out there also to help manage the risks as well. And I'll go through a few practical scenarios just to put a bit of context on it. Well, it does come as no surprise, I'm sure Rob's introduced these two topics already, but we'll just have a bit of a deeper dive into them. The construction industry has really been grappling, like a lot of other industries, with COVID-19 and Brexit. So let's have a look at COVID first. Still having a significant impact, obviously. Supply chains have been affected globally, and they still are being affected globally. And some work's been suspended because of lockdowns, and it's something we saw a lot more of during the first lockdown. So back in March, April last year, where there was a lot of uncertainty about how to react and what to do. But less so perhaps in the second and third lockdowns, as the industry understood how best to deal with them and how to make sites safe, etc. Also, there was a push from the government to very much crack on, but to obviously do this safely and within the guidelines such as those from the Construction Leadership Council. There's also been a number of labour resource issues, and which I'll mention again when we come on to talk about Brexit, obviously people having to self-isolate, etc. And all of this sort of mix is causing delay and disruption to the progress of projects, which is something Rob and I have been advising on regularly certainly over the last year since the pandemic started. And then there's the resulting claims and disputes that come out of this, and then of course some of the issues that Rob talked about as well, cash flow issues and insolvencies and job threats that come out of that. As I said, in England, the construction sector is seen very much as a key public service. Industry is dealing with the issues I've just gone through, but very much it's been told to crack on. However, it's cracking on easier said than done. It really is a tough time for the industry. And a key focus should always be to administer contracts properly. Rob and I deal with on a daily basis, making sure that you know making sure you do what you can do to complete the work within time and budget, and then there's doing what's possible to mitigate that delay and disruption. But at the same time, making sure that site operating procedures and other guidance from the government is followed as well. And on top of that, you've got the added pressure of staying protected from COVID and other health and safety regulations, with Freedom Day around the corner, and some of the restrictions may well continue to take effect on sites, but we envisage that companies may well be sort of left to their own devices in terms of mask wearing and social distance ruling. So we will have to see what the Construction Leadership Council comes up with over the next few weeks. I think their last version was on the site operating procedures was in January 2021. So I think there will be an update. And then, of course, all of this, as well as prioritising things like mental well-being of staff and protecting jobs as well. So pretty heavy mix of issues. And I've realised I've painted a pretty bleak picture to kick things off. And unfortunately, it does get even a little bit bleaker when you add the B word into the mixer as well. But with all risks, there are opportunities, and it isn't all doom and gloom. I mean, COVID-19 has forced companies to rely even more on technology, whether that's improving cybersecurity and connectivity. We're also seeing construction technology grow massively as a focal point, and we're seeing an increase in research and development with our clients in this space as well. So perhaps it's true that, no pain, no gain, that these are challenging times, but the industry could well be stronger as a result through innovation and, of course, resilience through this pandemic. An example I like to use about sort of innovation and looking towards the future through this pandemic is Lendlease, who have built a digitalization hub in Singapore. And I saw an interview from the CEO of Lendlease in Asia that said, well, the pandemic has actually really sped up the adoption of smart technologies around the world. And for Lendlease, he thinks that they've achieved in 1 year what they've originally set out to do in 5 years. And we'll touch on technology and digitalization a little bit later when we talk through the longer term opportunities. But first, what about Brexit? Well, Brexit has given us many known unknowns and probably quite a few unknown unknowns as well. For example, what trade terms with other jurisdictions, not just the EU, but other jurisdictions outside the EU will look like, and what impact that will have on supply chains and labour, particularly where there is that cross-border element. We are already seeing a skills shortage, which Rob touched on, from the EU, and it's hitting a lot of industries, but particularly construction. The government's promised huge infrastructure spends, Rob touched on, like HS2, Crossrail 2, etc. But where is the labour coming from here? And will there be enough to meet the time and cost demands of those huge projects? And how do you deal with this, with the potential skills shortage? Well, industry bodies are saying that it's about training and educating, addressing gender imbalances, and of course embracing the modern methods of construction and construction technology. So perhaps, again, it's no pain, no gain. Would these things have been progressed as much if Brexit and COVID weren't a problem? Certainly brought to the forefront a number of those sort of lingering sub-issues in the industry and trying to face them. So what are the other potential issues with Brexit? Well, UK and EU's announcement of a trade deal from the 1st of January earlier this year, it imposed no direct charges on construction products, but of course there are still administrative burdens when you're bringing materials in, and that does add to the cost, a lot of form filling and a lot of red tape. And we've also seen a rise in inflation over the last 6 months, and this is predicted to soar to 4% this year. And that's pretty huge when compared to what we've had over the last few years. And when you take in a devalued pound as well, suddenly goods and materials from abroad actually start to look pretty expensive. And this is an issue for companies that, for example, may have agreed project costs a few years ago before inflation hit at a greater than expected rate. Then you've also got potential funding issues with potentially a lack of access to those rates at the European Investment Bank, for example. And this could all increase the costs of financing some of UK's major infrastructure projects that are planned in the pipeline. And then if funding, of course, is more expensive, where else do you turn to? Do you turn to private equity, venture capitalists? Those sort of routes to funding can be extremely expensive. And of course, if building becomes more expensive, what are some of the consequences there? Is there likely to be a housing crisis? Are projects going to get built on time? Are they going to run out of funds? How is that all going to look? Again, this is actually it is a pretty bleak picture. I don't mean to sound all bleak here, but of course there are opportunities that arise from that as well. So government has said it's allocated that funding, as Rob touched on a bit earlier, and has said that construction is key to drive the recovery from COVID and Brexit. So there are opportunities there. And as the way we live and work changes and it adapts, potentially for that medium and even long term, the construction industry will be the ones at the forefront of that to deliver that change. So it could spell good news for the industry and could well be hopefully some busy years ahead for all of us. So as I say, there are opportunities where there are risks. So what can you do to protect yourself further, perhaps against some of these risks? Well, if you're dealing with some of the contracts, do encourage our clients, again, on a daily basis, understand your contractual obligations, make sure they're administered properly, maintain good records, photographs, etc., written reports, and try to deal with any issues head on. And you can do this by collaborating with other stakeholders on the project and really seeking to work together to resolve those issues and get your projects completed. One thing that Rob touched on was without prejudice conversations, which we've seen a lot of over the last 12 months, and we think we will see a bit more of it over the next few months. And they can be a really useful tool to get that open dialogue. But I will say this, you can't untell somebody something. So even if it's without prejudice, yes, that means it can't go in front of a court if the dispute turns formal, but it could well have an impact on your commercial standing if the dispute is heated and you're looking for settlement. So if you're unclear on what to say, what not to say, then do get some legal advice on that. And what about dealing with future threats of lockdowns? Well, yes, Freedom Day is around the corner, but it doesn't mean that we will never have to deal with any lockdowns. So again, it's important to look at your contracts, consider what they say about this, and understand where you stand, and to regularly revisit that, as well as issues like COVID and Brexit carry on. Because, I mean, for example, you may have adequate protection already against certain delays. You may be able to rely on change of law clauses, for example, or force majeure. So it's a good idea to understand what your contract says about these issues, as I'm sure you've heard many times over the last 12 months. You could also consider getting COVID clauses going forward, or, well, what sets out what is a pandemic event and what happens when one occurs. For example, a contractor could get extra time and a right to claim those costs for dealing with issues around the pandemic. But this, of course, gets complicated where you've got contract phases in a project, so like you would with some of the major infrastructure projects like Crossrail. And of course, so it does all depend on the wording of your contracts around how to deal with issues like pandemics in contracts. But it is important to note that any amends to risk allocation will come down to the bargaining positions of the parties. And if you're also, if you're making changes to your contracts, then it's important to note that, and remember, the contract works as a whole. So making amends to one section and adding definitions could well have an impact on another section. So again, if in doubt, just ask for some legal advice and help on this. It could be much more cost effective to understand your risks now than battling it out later in court or adjudication. And then just turning briefly to dealing with Brexit going forward. Some similar issues that have gone through with COVID just now, but you could, for example, if your contracts don't already deal with this, look at adding fluctuation clauses, which will deal with currency fluctuations. If, say, sterling tanks and you've got a contractor buying goods and services from abroad, can that contractor recoup those costs from the employer? And inflation is, as I said, a problem previously, is problematic in construction contracts, as usually the contractor has to bear the cost of those rising goods and materials, which are not usually claimable from the employer. And the JCT suggests that parties should consider including fluctuation provisions. JCT D&B, I think the default position is JCT fluctuations option A applies, and this provides for contracts to contribution levy and tax fluctuations which occur after the base date. So these fluctuation provisions work by allowing the contract sum to be adjusted throughout the contract project to account for those rising, or the risk of rising prices and goods and materials. And again, this shifts the burden of those rising costs during a project from the contractor back to the client. So yes, there's lots of tools already in the box, and so it is like I say, well worth revisiting your contract before and understanding where you stand before going ahead and looking at changes that you couldn't make. I'll pass you back to Rob now to introduce the long-term trends which we will talk through.
everything that we've said so far feels a little bit depressing, a little bit backwards looking in terms of where the industry is, what it's doing, how it's achieving everything it wants to achieve. What we're going to try and do now is focus a little bit more on the long term. What does that mean, really, looking a little bit further into the future, putting aside so much some of the struggles and some of the things that aren't working very, very well, and really looking for what are the opportunities, where can the industry really make a forwards. And we've tried to break that down into these three general areas. Now, the short term has been subdivided into a short, medium and long term part of the short term piece. And I think that's really what Tom and I have been focusing on. It's the here and now, it's the immediate future of next year, and it's the foreseeable future beyond that of approximately years 2023 and 2024. But beyond that, there's an awful lot of time for the industry to develop. And I think the key thing everyone needs to bear in mind is when you've got an industry the size of and an economy that's as developed as the UK economy, change does take time. And particularly where you're trying to bring in some potentially quite revolutionary changes and some changes that have significant potential cost impacts as well as the opportunities that come with them. They just need to play out over a slightly longer timescale, and we don't want to lose track of the overall direction of the construction industry by focusing too much on the here and now. So the four things that we're going to pick up on, four themes that we see sort of run out into the future and are really important. Urban dynamics, digitalization, diversity and decarbonisation, which we then labelled 4 Ds to focus on. Tom's going to talk a little bit about what urban dynamics is and how that works, then digitalization, which sort of marry up and show what the industry is doing in that sort of longer term space and how it might be developing right now. Then I'll pick up on diversity and decarbonisation as 2 of the other big trends and try and play them back in the same sort of way. So, Tom, do you want to start with urban dynamics first?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And as Rob said, hopefully this section will feel a bit more upbeat. I know that some of the issues we've spoken about have been pretty bleak, but I think it is important to be forward-facing and remain positive about what's coming up in the years ahead, because as we'll talk about, there is some quite exciting things around the corner. So firstly then, urban dynamics. What do we actually mean by urban dynamics? Well, it's about the ebbs and flow of how we work, how we live, and how we travel around our urban environments. Before the pandemic, a stat I really like, the UN was predicting that we'd see around 70% of the world's population living in urban areas by 2050. 29 years' time. To put that into perspective, I think we're at about 50 or 55% now. So it's quite a huge increase over the next few years. Has this prediction changed because of COVID? So as I said, that prediction of 70% was before the pandemic. My humble opinion, probably not. We are still talking about 2050 here. That's 30 years away. That's a very long time. Who knows when the dust may well settle on the pandemic, even if it stays in the system, even if COVID stays in the system and doesn't go away. I'm sure we'll carry on dealing with it in the right way over the next 30 years. So I think there will be a continuation of urbanization. It's just that perhaps urbanization will change slightly, but I think there will still be that general trend. But what does urbanization mean for the construction industry over that short, medium and long term? And how will the industry play a role in that? Well, over the short term, there has been that significant slowdown in urbanization over the last year, potentially even a reversal. I think for the first time, London saw an exodus rather than people coming into London for the first time in many years, as home workers were looking for that race for space. And this brings other changes and other challenges about how we use our local spaces. Perhaps our reliance on Amazon Prime, for example, and Amazon deliveries. But it's unlikely that offices will disappear altogether. There's more likely to be that shift in how we use office space. So, for example, will we use it for collaboration and meetings, or will we use it, rather than using it for the day-to-day tasks that we undertake? We think that any significant changes in the way we live in the urban environment will take place over that medium term, so that 5 years, and perhaps even venturing into the long term. And that's where there are opportunities that may well lie into to involvement of the construction industry and how the construction industry can shape this future. But what might it look like? Well, cities have been progressing and integrating digital technologies for a while now, and making cities smarter. So smart cities, that's how we are connected, and making cities more collaborative and sustainable. And this shift will surely continue post-pandemic over the medium and long term. Smart cities are constantly evolving. They don't just complete. There's always that evolution to make things better, to make the way we live better, and to adapt to our changing conditions. I just want to touch on a few examples that are already out there on how the construction industry can help have a look at, to help that future and what it may look like. There's in Barcelona, as an example, a few years Barcelona laid fibre optic cables throughout the entire city, and it provided free high-speed Wi-Fi to all of its residents, along with supporting integration of smart lighting and parking management and things like smart car parks. This boosted, I think, around 50,000 jobs in the process as well, in its integrating and putting that smart tech out there. But you might think, well, there are some dangers in that. These radical plans like having sensors and increasing CCTV and monitoring and whereabouts, monitoring where citizens are. It does sort of all sound a bit for Big Brother. So policymakers and city planners do need to be careful here. Another example I like about what the future may hold for cities is a bridge in Amsterdam called the MX3D. And this is a fascinating project. It's the world's first 3D printed steel bridge. And when they built it, they fully equipped it with sensors. And those sensors stream data to the cloud, and it's then processed, and it gives engineers that visualization of that data about the bridge. So what's its structural integrity looking like, and how to perhaps change the surrounding neighborhood and environment. I mean, it collects things like pollution levels and things like that. It's really, really clever. And then it sends that data to those engineers, where also if it needs maintenance as well, and it can even talk to roadways in the area to help time traffic lights, to reduce congestion at certain times, etc. And this is all aimed at improving the quality of our lives and making our cities more sustainable and connected. And the industry, construction industry, is going to deliver that change. So what tools are out there to deliver the change? And this comes on nicely to me to talk about the next transitional trend, which is digitalization. So I'll just change the slide there. What is digitalization? Well, digitalization is pretty wide-ranging transformation, but it's not just about making things digital, but it's the process of leveraging that digitization and technology to improve business process. So in the construction industry, I'll give you an example, digitalization includes things like artificial intelligence and BIM and digital twins and modern methods of construction such as prefabrication or 3D printing, and even to the use of drones on sites that can monitor and analyze send data and to clever pieces of software which will monitor activity and analyze that data. which can then automatically update programs, for example, where there's been delay, and generate live progress updates to clients as well. So really, when we talk about digitalization, we're not just talking, it's about being a facilitator or enabler to get, for example, to that carbon net zero, which Rob will, I'm sure, mention in the next slide when we talk about decarbonisation. So how can it help the construction industry over the short, medium and long term? Well, construction historically has been rife with problems, which the Farmer Report talked about, which Rob mentioned earlier, issues such as low predictability and high risks and often low margins. And the drive towards digitalisation is to improve those things through cost savings and increased accuracy, which will hopefully help reduce disputes and also improvements to things like health and safety as well. But there is a risk to its adoption. If it, for example, adopts too quickly, and those companies that are able to invest in its adoption and have those research and development teams, they may well shoot off in one direction, but actually it may leave companies who don't have the resources to, or the R&D departments or the money to invest in that technology to stay behind, and that may create this two-speed industry. So it's really important that when we talk about this adoption, we do it with the right, we train people right skills, and we perhaps ponder some of the bigger questions. Is the industry ready for big data, and what can it do to help it be ready for big data? And in the short and medium terms, especially as we look at things like drones and robotics on sites that are being used more and more, we may see a number of trial and error in projects, which is obviously normal, but it does sort of prompt us to be quite careful in that kind of allocation of risk at the outset. And then over the longer term, we are likely to see a continued shift in digital workflow management and project tracking. So we could see smart contracts connected to a cloud system that monitor progress on site and automatically release funds when certain milestones are hit, for example. So it's quite exciting stuff. And whilst it sounds scary that certain jobs may be at risk with all this automation, the research does show that technology will also be there to enhance jobs as well and to reskill people rather than replace jobs altogether. And I'll just leave you with a quote from Bill Gates on this section, and you may well have heard this before, so apologies, but I do quite like it. Bill Gates said, most people overestimate what they can do in 1 year, and they underestimate what they can do in 10 years. And he said, don't let yourself be lulled into inaction. So if we listen to Bill Gates, we should be patient with our aspirations to change the industry, and we shouldn't be discouraged if we face challenges in the short term, such as Brexit and COVID. So it really is that big picture which we need to focus on. And I'll pass you back to Rob to talk about those remaining 2 Ds.
Thanks very much, Tom. I think Tom's really covered the what and the how of the 4 Ds. So the what around urban dynamics, urbanization, what are we trying to achieve, what's society trying to achieve, and the how is through digitalization, the constant improvement of process, advancements in not just us build, but to incorporate into construction to help us maintain, regenerate, improve for the future. I think having looked at the what and the how, I'm going to touch on these 2 topics, diversity and decarbonisation, in a context of a why type question. So why are we doing a lot of what we're doing? And the first one I'll touch on is diversity. You might often see not diversity on its own, but diversity and inclusion. And I've removed the and inclusion, not because I want to downplay inclusion. It's a very important topic, But in my view, at least, if you have a properly diverse system or properly diverse group of people, company, it is by its very nature inclusive, because diversity isn't just about gender diversity, racial diversity. It's got to capture diversity of thought, diversity of approach, diversity of ideas, because if it's not that diverse a system, then we're going to lose out a lot of those opportunities. One of the things to bear in mind whenever you look at diversity within the construction industry is that we have to recognise that as an industry, construction has a problem with diversity. It is not a diverse system, it's not a diverse sector, it doesn't properly represent society as a whole. And I mean that not if you look at the overall statistics, but if you drill down into individual roles. So whether you look at professional engineers, quantity surveyors, board members, whatever area you like to look at, there is issues, or there are issues around the diversity that we see within construction. I think as we sort of cast this sort of thought process forwards into the future, trying to be positive and look at the opportunity, it's very easy to get lulled into diversity, whether in the short, medium or longer terms, as being all around dealing with a skills shortage by enabling more people at different sectors of different types of people to come into and work effectively within the construction industry. But that's not, for me, what diversity is really all about. Diversity is much broader than that, and it plays into what Tom was saying around urban dynamics and digitalization. You need the diversity of thought, you need the diversity of ideas, the thought, the processes that go behind it, the challenge to what we've always done. You remember I said earlier in this presentation, are we just caught up in the problems of the past? If we don't have diversity, if we don't have a change in momentum in the way we think about ourselves, we're never going to get past those sorts of issues. It's not a new topic. Diversity is spoken about regularly, I was going to say, but consistently over years, diversity keeps being returned to as an issue for the construction industry. And the fact that it keeps being returned to is a good thing, that we keep talking about it. The fact that it needs to keep being talked about is a little bit sad, really, that we haven't managed to deal with the problems that we all know about already. So what I'd like to see, and this is one of those issues that is certainly not a short term, but is really playing into the medium and long term, is to get our industry into a position where we don't need to talk about diversity anymore because we've achieved it. And diversity is achievable. There's no reason why we can't have a diverse industry with properly diverse thought, properly diverse people being involved at different levels and engaging with everyone else. And that includes, diversity of age groups and how you bring younger practitioners into more senior roles and more decision-making roles so that you can accelerate through some of the innovation and change that may see some resistance at older, more established people who just have a set way of doing things. In addition to diversity, another important point playing into that why issue is decarbonisation. There is no doubt that, again, the world faces a carbon challenge, and that is something that has to be dealt with. Construction as an industry is one of the higher producers of carbon into the atmosphere. So when we talk about decarbonisation within the construction industry, opportunities now for decarbonisation, whether that's using low carbon cement or even better, not having quite so much new build and really focusing on how we regenerate and reuse rather than building with a little bit of a decarbonisation saving. Sitting in the background behind the decarbonisation will also be the amount of power that construction industry uses and the amount of power that is used in operation and maintenance of buildings that have been constructed, and is all part of the same sort of general industry review. So when you start thinking about decarbonisation, again, it feels like that's a very long-term issue, but in order to start decarbonising and to have a real impact, the sooner we start getting on top of this and dealing with it and making even quite small changes, the greater the impact will be. At the end of this year, we have COP26, climate change, particularly decarbonisation, worldwide, focus on what should we be doing? Are we achieving the targets? I think it's a challenge to every construction company to really think about what are they doing? Are they doing enough? A lot of big contractors now do have decarbonisation and green statements. It's becoming a necessary part of doing business that you have an environmental, social governance impact plan and that you then deliver on it. The question is, are we doing enough? And the opportunity that comes behind that is to be in not only to the benefit of society as a whole, to be more closer to carbon neutral, but to differentiate yourself in the market as someone who's really thinking about this and living the ideals of a lot of the investors in the built environment now, who are looking specifically at ESG or decarbonisation goals and how they're being achieved. So it really is a massive opportunity to start decarbonising our industry. Having looked at those sort of four overarching opportunities in a little bit of detail, I'm just going to hand back to Tom to pick up on a product that we've been working on over the last 18 months or so.
Thanks, Rob. Excuse me. Yeah, so as Rob says, we've put together, we built an online and interactive toolkit. We, Osborne Clarke, have in our team, and the idea is to help those working on construction projects deal with COVID-19 related claims and disputes. So it's got a homepage, which is you can see on the screen here, and with links to certain sections like our commentary on standard forms and how to deal with COVID-19 related claims. It's got a dispute section outlining how the formal dispute process works, and amongst other sections such as further insight section on where we provide regular updates on things like commentary on the construction market in light of lockdowns and government regulations, etc. It is a password protected site, so if you'd like access, please do get in touch and we'll send you a link with the password. Our email addresses are you can find them online, but they're also in these slides as well, on the next slide, I think. And then with the success of this, we've had really good feedbacks, had thousands of views and users. We're at the moment we're developing our further toolkits, and we hope to roll one out before the end of the year. So do watch this space. And if you'd like to follow Rob and I on LinkedIn, you'll see that we'll keep you posted on our progress as well. Thanks, Rob. And back to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tom. So I'll put our contact details up, as Tom said. If you want access to the toolkit, if you want to generally talk about any of the issues that we've raised today, do feel free to drop us a line. I haven't seen any questions come up in the Q&A, and I can see we are just at the end of our time. So I'll pause for a second and see if anyone in the audience does have a question. Otherwise, we'll leave the webinar there. So just pausing for a second to see if there are any questions anyone would like us to deal with. Obviously, we covered everything really well, Tom. No questions from anyone. Thank you very much for joining the webinar. The slides and a recording will be available through the YPG portal within the next week or so. So please do feel free to pass on that link to any other members who might have not been able to get here today, anyone else that you know that would benefit from reviewing what we've talked about. Thank you very much for coming. It was always a pleasure to work with the JCT to present this webinar for you. Thank you.